Thank you, Dan. Dan, can I enlist your service one more time? I appreciate the warm introduction. Very much too kind. So, got a couple handouts here. Hopefully, that'll help listen to my incessant rambling that we're gonna go through here today. So, yeah, good. I didn't even realize I was the first one of the year. Look at that, right? So, what that might mean is that they'll only get better from here, because as we hear, the first will be last. So, we got that to look forward to. As we do with all good endeavors, why don't we begin with prayer? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Gracious Father in heaven, we give you thanks and praise for this day, an opportunity to steal away to a deserted place, and not only to pray, but to learn, and to sit at your feet, and to hear your word, and to come to a deeper understanding of who you are and who we are in relationship to you. We understand ourselves as those beings created for perfection, and we know that perfection comes through virtue. And so as we endeavor upon this path of virtuous seeking after holiness, we ask for the grace and companionship of all the saints and angels, but in particular this day, we seek and implore the help of Mother Mary, that her mantle would be wrapped around us, and that we would be drawn into deeper friendship with Saint Joseph, who is the just man. We pray this in and through the name of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So, today's topic is justice. Everybody's favorite, right? So, it's good, though, to talk about justice, particularly in our day and age, and to understand it as a virtue. It's not just some ethereal concept. It is actually a virtue, which means it's something that can perfect us, something that can make us better, and something that we, ultimately need to have. So, being that it is a virtue, it's good for us to perhaps start with what's a virtue. And here the oblates are going to go, oh, again, Father? We heard this during our whole retreat. So the oblates had a great blessing of being with the oblates on their retreat this year. And we talked about the virtue of charity, but nonetheless, virtue itself is kind of like an overarching understanding of what makes virtue. So what is a virtue? Human virtue, according to St. Thomas in his Prima Pars, so the first part of the second part, human virtue, which is an operative habit, is a good habit, productive of good works. So that is coming straight from the Summa Theologiae. Father John Hardon, who is really a good Thomistic scholar, he notes that St. Thomas defines virtue as a good habit bearing on activity, or a good faculty. A habit, he says, habitus operativus bonus in the Latin. Generic to the concept of virtue, Hardon goes on, is the element of habit which stands in a special relation to the soul, whether in the natural order or elevated to the divine life of grace. In short, then, what a virtue is a habit formed by one seeking to do the good. It is a disposition toward doing the good. So there's an activity involved. Now really, Aquinas is going to be our go-to. St. Thomas Aquinas is the one that we want to turn to really with all things that deal with virtue. But it's good for us to understand that what Aquinas was so good at was synthesizing all those great thoughts that had come before him. And so Aquinas is going to draw upon Augustine and upon Aristotle in these kinds of areas of looking at virtue. And so we can see that the issue of justice is something that's really been contemplated, we might say, for quite some time, going all the way back to the time of Aristotle. Joseph Pieper, who's also a really great Thomist, in addition to John Hardon, he notes that Aristotle begins talking about justice by first talking about injustice, precisely because we as human beings tend to be more aware of an injustice than we do of an act of justice, right? It's not fair, right? So that's kind of the cry of the childish human heart, right? We all do it. But it means that we're generally more aware of an injustice present in our life than maybe justice at work. And so that's where he begins to start. It's really a popular outcry this day, isn't it? All these injustices that we see, everybody's crying about injustice, from one end of the earth to the next, or perhaps from one pole to the next. We're a globe, not a flat earth. So, but the reality is that what that begins to indicate for us is that we live in a rather confused culture these days. And so we need to examine where justice falls into all of this. Because if we're honest with ourselves, if we do a good examination and kind of look at where we're at as a culture, we're going to pretty quickly discover that our culture has seemingly divorced itself from true morality and so has abandoned virtue as a noble pursuit. This is not generally held up for us as something we should be seeking these days. That virtue has kind of gone another direction there. Welcome. What remains is a free-for-all in our day and age, right? There's a sort of free-for-all in which we're all left to determine for ourselves what's good, what's true, what's beautiful, which inevitably is different for each individual if there's no objectivity. And so everyone feels like they're being treated unjustly because for me and my particular set of understandings over here in my truth, this would be the just thing to do. You're not living in my truth. Get your act together, right? Justice. Because of course, what we come to realize is there's really no basis in reality anymore. Right? We're kind of living in a virtual reality in many ways. And so this kind of causes us, again, a lot of confusion. It could be argued, if you wanted to, that it's a direct result of a lack of justice, true justice in our culture. That a lot of this is coming from a lack of understanding of true justice. And as we'll see in a bit, justice is concerned with giving to another what's rightfully theirs. But the prevailing concern this day seems to be, but what's due to me? Right? So there's an inward focus, which kind of begins to move us away from actual true justice and the concerning of it, particularly in light of the virtue of charity. So if we couple justice with charity, there's the need for an objective truth, and without it, we're left in utter confusion with regard to basic human rights. What this begins to reveal is that there's something that must precede justice. It must originate in an objective, transcendent reality. Truth itself, goodness itself. That's really where it wants to begin. And Augustine will sort of begin to make this statement: if the act of justice is to give to each one his due, which it is, then the act of justice is preceded by the act whereby something becomes his due, which is rather wordy, and I like that because so am I. Joseph Pieper correctly derives from this statement by Augustine, right, the notion of rights. We have certain rights. We really do, right? And so we need to understand what those are. And so for the sake of brevity, certain rights that pertain to every single human being, we would understand those as being God-given rights. Right? So it transcends any one nation or country. It's just true for everyone because of how we're made and who we're made in relation with. So Augustine also holds up for us that it's through creation that the created being first comes to have his rights. So, which, again, just basic understanding of order, right? As we're created, we get rights. That's not so hard to understand, right? And yet, it's not as though any of us creatures are due to be created, right? So if justice is giving to one what they're due, or we might say giving to one what they ought to have, then we take a step back from that and say, I actually don't deserve to exist. I did nothing prior to my existence to demand that I should exist. And so, right, I'm created, right, not necessarily out of justice. It must be something else, which is beautiful. It's a good thing, right? So God was not obligated to create. Nice. Now, Dr. Larry Feingold, who was my teacher for many classes in the seminary, quite possibly the smartest man I've ever met, just a phenomenal human being, genius, but he's coming out of a Thomistic tradition. He would often remind us that creation was an act of God's mercy. And I would always kind of balk at that, and it's like, but that's Dr. Feingold. I'm not going to argue with him. I will lose. But like, I wanted always to say, no, like, it's got to be an overflowing of his charity, which it is also that. It's just not part and parcel in God, all is one in him. But his notion of it being an act of mercy was precisely because he's giving to something they don't deserve. They have no right to it. There's no demand for him to do this, and yet he does it, and he gives to somebody something that they're not due. Right? Life in and of itself, which is a beautiful thing. Well, as much as I wanted to argue Dr. Feingold, and as much as I would have lost, because what we come to find out is that we actually first encounter this notion of justice, or even mercy, in the Prima Pars, the first part of Thomas's Summa Theologiae in question 21. And the title of that question is The Justice and Mercy of God. So right there, he's coupling them together from the very beginning. The very first time that St. Thomas is going to treat of justice, he's also already pulling in the notion of mercy. So justice is giving to one what is his due. Mercy, giving to one what is not his due. Or we might say even forgiving the debt that's due. So there's in that case, right, the one who is due something is foregoing what is due to him or to her. And in this, we also see an act of mercy. What's good for us to understand is that really the crux of justice is an understanding of what is due to another. So what is due to another? That's the question that inevitably comes up. And Thomas begins to consider this question. What is due to another? And here he arrives at the conclusion that it really depends on the situation and the two individuals that are involved. Because, as Thomas will note, there's actually two types of justice. There's commutative, and then there's distributive. Now, commutative is really probably what you and I are going to be really most familiar with in our regular day-to-day lives. It's kind of what we're steeped in. It's just simply an exchange of goods or a business transaction. It's contractual in many ways, right? So I do this and I get that. Or if you do this, I will give that, right? That's the commutative type of justice. It involves giving to another what they're due, and it happens between what we might call essential equals. So two people that are sort of equals. And this is, again, so even if you have a boss and worker scenario, they're really on an equal playing field because they both have a need. The boss has work that needs to be done. The worker has mouths to feed, we could say, and needs payment in a job. And so they enter into a contractual agreement on an equal kind of level. They both come into it with understandings of the demands and understandings of the recompense, right? And so there's a situation between equals, even in a contractual situation between boss and worker. And so again, yeah, it will contain within it a notion of restitution, right? Giving back to one what is his to begin with. So again, if we're going to go back to the work environment, like we don't get paid as we're working. Like it's not like I get put in an hour and I get, $10 from the guy. Okay, great. There's your $10 for that hour. Okay, he's going along. You made it halfway. Here's $5. Okay, great. Generally speaking, we're going to get paid monthly or biweekly or whatever, right? And so I've put in so many hours, I'm due a certain amount back. And so you could even see this in a form of restitution. I'm being paid back what is already rightfully mine. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the commutative side of things. Now, this is not of God. No, it doesn't mean it's evil. It just means it's not actually related to God, or it's not how we find ourselves in relation to God in the sense of justice. Precisely because we're not on an equal playing field with God. This is not a relationship between equals. He is the supreme being. We are not. Thanks be to God for that. So this is where distributive justice will come in. Now this kind of form of justice is going to take place between a ruler or a steward and then his subjects. So the ruler or the steward gives to each subject according to their rank, Thomas will say. And so even here, what we might understand is not every single subject is going to get the same thing. It depends on their rank. And the rank, guess who that comes from? The ruler, right? So this actually is pertaining to our relationship with God. Yay, right? He's the supreme ruler. So Thomas will go on to say, as then the proper order displayed in ruling a family or any kind of multitude evinces justice of this kind in the ruler. So if we have a just ruler is basically what all that means. So the order of the universe, which is seen both in effects of nature and in effects of will, shows forth the justice of God. So he being a just ruler, we look around and we can see his justice at work in creation around us. That's kind of the long and the short of what was just said. Then he quotes Dionysius, and Dionysius says, we must needs see that God is truly just in seeing how he gives to all existing things what is proper to the condition of each. So again, he's giving to us according to our need. We don't all have the same needs. We're not all ranked the same in various ways, right? And God is giving according to each, according to their needs. That's what he's kind of getting at there. And preserves the nature of each in the order and with the powers that properly belong to it. So again, he's giving to each according to their need. You and I are rational beings. We need grace, precisely because the end for which we were made is perfect union with God, which requires grace. That is not the end for which a skunk was made. Thanks be to God. I had this image of like incense, but never mind. And so the skunk doesn't need grace, so he's not going to get grace. Right? So again, there's a ranking of creatures, and each one gets what's necessary for that particular creature. Now, the skunk will get existence, and God will provide various things for it to eat along the way, and other skunks to continue to persist in their existence as a creature, right? So this is how God works his distributive justice out in creation. And if we just take a moment to pause and reflect on creation, we can kind of understand that and see it at work. Now, Thomas will go on to say that the determination of what is due in this particular form of distributive justice, that can only come from the position and the viewpoint of the one responsible for the common weal or the common good, we might say. And for the very reason that a due and fitting share in the common good is involved. This is Pieper kind of coming out of the Thomistic tradition, right? So what Pieper's pointing at is that in distributive justice, the determination of what is due to each subject, that resides in the ruler, right? So, great. We can see where this might be heading. Justice and equity cannot be considered with regard to actual value alone. So there's going to be, as Thomas will point out, a proportionality, right? So even within the human race, there's going to be a proportionality of grace given in particular means and at particular times. So today's saint, St. Denis, right, was given a particular share of God's grace to witness all the way to martyrdom, right? And then even afterwards, I love his story. We'll get into that at Mass, but he walks around beheaded with his head in his hand. I love that. So he's given a particular share of grace that maybe I'm not at any given moment, right? Because I'm not maybe being called to that right now. So there's proportionality. We could also think of then our response in this form of distributive justice, how we're giving ourselves back to God. And here we could think of that gospel scene where Jesus is pointing out, hey, did you see how the Pharisee, right, walked in and dropped some money in the collection bucket there, making a lot of noise and calling a lot of attention to himself to let everybody know he's putting a lot in there. But the widow who just kind of sneaks in and puts in her last 2 coins, she gave more. Precisely because of this notion of proportionality with regard to distributive justice. Is that good? So, 2 things with distributive justice need to be held in concert with each other. We need genuine authority. Makes sense. They're the one making the kind of the rules and distributing all the good stuff. And then the individual person to whom his right is absolutely due from the social whole. So you have a ruler and subjects. Those things just need to be held in concert. In our day and age, and kind of throughout the history of humanity, this will necessarily find itself lived out in a political system of one sort or another, right? And so you have this notion of the state or a nation, which has authority and power to maintain the good of the community. That really is a form of distributive justice, and it is good, right? So we need to have these kinds of things in place to help us to live to our fullest, right? But Thomas will say, in all of that, it comes about that there's really no greater evil than an unjust government. Precisely because of the good which is necessary to be distributed through the government, right? And so when they are not good, what happens? And he's also kind of coming out of Augustine's understanding that there's no greater community than a political community, right? So Augustine would say that the political community is the highest level of community. And so it's just good for us to kind of play around with this in our own thoughts and in our minds and our ponderings. What makes a good government? Are we living with a good government? What happens when government does this or that or the other thing? And so even though there is this notion of the common good, we'll have the church throughout the ages saying, but that doesn't mean Marxism or communism, right? So we just want to be understanding that. And what the good ruler, so again, you're talking about, okay, the good ruler is just giving everything to the subjects. That's great. What does he get? If he's not a tyrant, right? What's in it for the ruler? And we'll say that the good ruler gets in return for distributing the goods to his people according to their rank. You know, as he's doing this job of distributing according to the rank, Thomas will say, here's what he gets. He gets to be near God and to stand at his side inasmuch as he has faithfully exercised the king's divine office over his people. And so Thomas sees, right, the king as one who has been divinely appointed for this holy task of making sure everybody gets what they need. Wow. So here we begin to see that even the king is participating as a subject in the distributive justice of God, right? And the ultimate and supreme ruler is he who sits outside of time and above all things and has made all things, right? And that is good for us. So this, of course, then brings us back, long circular route. Thank you, JP2, for having your influence on me. Brings us back to that place in which Thomas first addresses justice, the question 21 that we talked about, which deals with justice and mercy. So the question is titled Justice and Mercy of God. I can hear the groans for those who are with RCA, because I'm probably getting to that terrible joke that will come in just a moment. We can briefly mention that mercy is in many ways akin to both justice and charity, right? So justice is going to have something to do with, or mercy is going to have something to do with both justice and with charity. Everything's one in God, so we just need to parcel it out for our own understanding. But since all good things come from God and ought to be directed back toward him, God can do whatever he wants with each one. And since he's good, whatever he does is good. Nice, right? For this reason, God can absolve us of sin, even though we did absolutely nothing to deserve it, right? So we don't do any, this is not the commutative justice, right? I don't go, okay, you, sir, I'm going to go do this, and you have to forgive me. Right? That's actually not how it works. God says, I long for you to be with me, so I will forgive you. Right? Would you follow me yet again? That's kind of how it plays itself out. The action of God is merciful toward us, but also an act of justice toward himself, which is fun for us to ponder. Right? So we experience this notion of forgiveness by way of mercy. God experiences this notion of forgiveness of his human beings by way of justice. How? Well, because if we understand that we, as being, have come directly from him, he made us, we wouldn't be here without him, in some sense, he is due our being back to himself. But if we've cut ourselves off from him by sin, then the mercy that forgives us and restores that ability to come back to him is really a way for him to give back to himself what he's due, which is justice. Amazing. It's good for us to understand that. Now, all that is to say mercy's good. It's related to justice. That's all I'm going to say about mercy because I can't do it justice. Yes! There's the pun in such a short time. Sorry. It's the coffee. So this is all where Thomas begins, right? And then he kind of fleshes out a whole lot of other stuff before coming back to virtue in general. And he devotes an enormous section of his Summa to virtue in general and then walks through each of the virtues, right? So in the Secunda Secundae, the second part of Thomas's Summa, he finally comes back to the notion of justice. And this would be in question 57 of his Secunda Secundae. So here he returns to it and he dives into a little bit more detail. He reaffirms that the virtue of justice is in fact a habit. Good, because that's what a virtue is. But he says it's a habit by which men are capable of doing just or right actions. And what's more, he continues to kind of play this out a little bit. So he wants to end finally with this sort of definition of justice as rendering to each one his right by a constant and perpetual will. So, we can do a just action. Margaret was going to give me my own carafe of coffee. That's good and right and just. But it doesn't mean that the virtue of justice has been embodied, right? So when we have mastery over a virtue, it means that we live in every moment of our lives this particular virtue. It's constant and it's perpetual, right? So I'm just going to naturally be doing this thing. So if I have mastery over the virtue of prudence, I will just necessarily in every moment be arriving at the correct conclusion of what is the right choice. Does that make sense? So that's mastery over a virtue. If I have mastery over charity, then I will always be loving my neighbor, even if they're a Yankees fan, right? So.
Can you repeat just that one sentence?
Yes.
Mastery of virtue is constant and perpetual.
Yes, it is. So rendering to each, this is justice, rendering to each one his right by a constant and perpetual will. And the will is the choice, right? This is the faculty by which we choose or we act. So you have the intellect and you have the will. The intellect knows things, the will chooses and does things, right? So this is by virtue of the will. To be extra clear, and I think it might be on the handout too. I think it's somewhere in there, that line is there. Yeah.
But can you say the second part where you said, okay, so constant and perpetual will, but the natural, like you're naturally acting at every moment?
Yeah, so when we have mastery over a virtue, we don't have to think about it, and it's not a sort of an intermittent, I've done a good deed, right? It's not sort of like, oh yeah, I was just in this one action today. And then I went and robbed the bank, I kind of beat the widow in the street and stole her last 2 coins that she was going to give to, right? But this over here, I did this just action, right? So when I have mastery over a virtue, I'm living that virtue in every moment of my life because it is perpetual.
So it's become natural, it's no longer laborious.
Exactly. That's exactly right, which is why we can be joyful in it, even in the face of adversity, right? So I can be joyful in living charity, right? And as I'm on the cross, pray for the thief next to me, right? Or for the one who's nailed me. Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. Right? So here's again, I'm living it in this moment of hardship without even having to really think about it. It's just so ingrained in my being that I'm going to do this, right? So I think, there's any number of ways maybe we could examine that in various and different virtues. So I'm in a traffic jam and I don't have to tell myself, okay, be patient, right? It's just not even, I'm just okay with it in some sense of yeah, all right, there's a traffic jam here and I can wait it out because what else am I going to do?
So it's easier to do it than to not do it once you've actually mastered it.
That's correct. Yep, that's correct. Yep. Great question. Love it. Okay, and so then we can look at this and we can say, okay, Thomas wants to be extra clear. He goes on to question 58 and poses the question, whether justice is a virtue, at which point he says, yes, and then he moves on. Great. Thank you, Thomas. So it's also good to note that justice pertains to the act, right? So if we go back to the beginning, we talk about what a virtue is. It really isn't necessarily the carrying of something out, right? And so particularly with justice, it is involved with the action itself, right? So it has to do with the act. It's not just enough for us to know what this person deserves, right? There's plenty of corrupt bosses, right, and corrupt like business owners out there. They know full well what somebody's due, right? But then they're like, but I can get away with paying them less, right? So they know what the just thing is to do, and they choose not to do it. Justice, the virtue of justice would say, no, I'm going to actually do what's just, right? So the virtue of justice pertains to the action, which is why then we'll say that justice resides in the will and not in the intellect, right? So justice, the virtue of justice, is going to pertain to our will. I will what is just. I am going to do or choose to do what is just. This is probably really where it's going to be distinguished from the virtue of prudence, because prudence resides in the intellect. Prudence is understanding and knowing what the right thing is, what the good is in any given circumstance. Justice gives that which is good to the one who deserves it. So all that is to say that we need to then begin to determine what is just, what's due to another, and then to carry out the action of giving what is due. How is that determined? Is that a social construct within ourselves? Is it divinely revealed? How do we come about and understand this? In question 57, there's the way Thomas structures his Summa, if you're not familiar, he begins by naming all of the objections that could possibly arise to his proposed statement. He's really good at that, exhaustive. Then he has an on the contrary, so he refutes in a one-sentence kind of way all the objections. I say that, and he gives his sort of dissertation on that particular question, and then he comes afterwards and directly answers every one of the objections. Right? So that's the structure of how he walks through his Summa. Here in his response to the second objection for question 57, which was justice itself, right, on justice, he says this. Thomas says, the human will can, by common agreement, make a thing to be just, provided it be not of itself contrary to natural justice. And it is in such matters that positive right has its place. If, however, a thing is of itself contrary to natural right, the human will cannot make it just. For instance, by decreeing that it is lawful to steal or to commit adultery. Hence it is written in Isaiah, woe to them that make wicked laws. We cannot legislate the legality of abortion and make it just. That is an impossibility according to Aquinas and really to God. So that's what he's getting at here. Yes, we can come up with social constructs, and this can have a bearing on what is just and what is due. For example, the minimum wage. Nowhere in Scripture is it going to tell us how much we should pay an individual, right? So that's a social construct that we can come to an agreement on. Not everybody might agree, but the community might agree overall, and we name it, this is a just wage. That could be true in some regard, but what we can't do is come to an agreement on something that just in and of itself violates natural law and say, but that's just. Does that make sense? Which is why justice is extremely important for us these days, right? There's a lot of stuff being legislated, and we need to do our due diligence to determine whether or not this can accord with natural law or divine law, right? And then we move from there. So all that seems very reasonable, right? I mean, as we hear it, it seems very reasonable to us. The reality is it's not always easy. Just take that example of a just wage. How do you know? You can go look at Leo's Rerum Novarum, right? And in there he begins to talk about, well, a just wage is that by which somebody can live in such a manner as to have all the basic needs for their life, for their family, and then also just a little bit extra so that they can have some comfort should something happen or should they need some form of leisure, right? So that's a pretty wide open, so what's to say this amount or that amount is just? Then we can get back to the distributive justice portion and we can say, yeah, but this individual over here spent 8 years in college because he's kind of a nut job and he decided to study both architecture and engineering. Is his wage, should he be paid more than the tech who's just doing the CAD drafting? Maybe. I don't even want to propose an answer, but you see where that begins to even play out. What is a just compensation, right, or restitution in these regards? So it's not always clear, but when there is a very clear violation of natural law or divine law, we could be pretty certain there. Yeah, this is not a just law. And then the just law does not have bearing upon us. So it's good for us to understand that. All right, getting back to distributive justice and to God, he gives us both physical and spiritual life, and in return is due our whole being. Yay! He gave us everything, he deserves it all back. This is pretty simple for us to understand. But in a particular way, you and I do this through what we might call worship, right? And so this is going to get into what Thomas talks about as the virtue of religion. So Thomas calls religion a virtue, and he sort of makes it a subset of justice, precisely because it's the virtue by which we give back to God what is his due, namely honor, reverence, worship, all those, right, adoration. So this is where Thomas is going to get in questions 55 and 58 of the second part of the second part. He goes on to say religion's a virtue because it's that which makes his possessor good and his act good. So when I have the virtue of religion, not only does it perfect me, but it perfects my actions, is basically what Thomas is going to say, right? So and then he goes on to point out, it's evident that to render anyone his due has the aspect of good. So here he's pointing back to some previous things he's said in the Summa. And since by rendering a person his due, one becomes suitably proportioned to him through being ordered to him in a becoming manner. So again, the virtue of religion orders us to God, puts us in this sort of correct proportional relationship to him, right, in a becoming manner. So that's why, so Thomas is saying it orders us to our end, that for which we were made, to the supreme good, and in that makes us good. And this is the virtue of religion. So the virtue of religion, we give due honor to God. What's more, it properly orders us to our end, as I said, makes us good. The act by which we carry out is necessarily good as well. Just kind of as we're perfected in God, just like he can't do anything evil, the more we are in union with him, the more we find ourselves unable to do evil things. Or not choosing, I should say, to do evil things. We're very capable of it. But all that being true, we might see then that by way of distributive justice, not only is God due our worship, which he is, but also that we are due the freedom to pay such worship to God. So this then has a bearing on the political authority. If by virtue we must worship God, then those who have been divinely appointed by God, we might say, remember Thomas talks about the divine appointment of the ruler, they have a certain responsibility to allow that to take place. So here, let's go back to the Israelites in Egypt, right? And Moses, let my people go so we can go worship. No. Here's a tyrant and an unjust ruler, right? Because God precisely was asking, I want you to come out into the wilderness and to worship. You owe me that because I made you, right? And so, okay, but then the political authority is saying, no. Right? So we are due, we might say we have a right to worship God, right? Precisely because he is the one true God, and he has asked us to do that. So we have that. So there's a bearing on the political authority in this regard too. Again, it's good for us to know. Okay, so this is why, again, Thomas is going to talk about the tyrannical government being the greatest evil and all that kind of stuff. So here's the deal, though. We all know we're all fallen human beings. We're all prone to do really bad things, and this is true of the political authority as well, whether it be king or any other form of democracy or whatever, right? So if there is a situation in which the political authority is oppressing religious groups and saying you don't get to worship, it doesn't actually free us up from growing in the virtue of religion. It's a virtue. We're called to grow in it. What that might mean is even if we can't come publicly to worship, God is still due praise from our own heart, mind, soul, and strength, right? So in our own private, we're still, right, we can still commune with God in our own hearts and souls, and that we are called to do. Which moves us into this notion of holiness and justice, which I know holiness is near and dear to the oblates and to all of you who are here, right? So in question 81 of the Secunda Secundae, Thomas's second part of the second part, he notes that holiness requires one to have their mind firmly set upon the supreme truth. So holiness is having our mind set firmly upon the supreme truth. What's more, Thomas identifies holiness as pertaining to the virtue of religion. Look at that. It's all coming together, right? And so we've already said that's a subset of justice. And so actually justice continues to be extremely important for us as a virtue, which maybe we would initially maybe just kind of slough off, focus on charity or right or prudence or patience, right? But actually justice begins to be really quite important for us. When we give ourselves over fully to God, as we are called to do, when we render to him the supreme truth, because that's who he is also goodness, the supreme goodness. When we render to him what is rightfully his, namely our whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, as we hear in the scriptures, when we do this in charity, then we'll necessarily find ourselves growing in holiness. So as we're giving back to God what is his due, we're actually being perfected and growing in holiness. Nice, right? Like that all works out. This is great. I'm not losing anything, right? He's actually giving me more. And this will work itself out in our day-to-day as we encounter the Christ in the one, these least of these, who is in need. And then by justice, give to that individual what is their due, right? So as I'm encountering a suffering Christ, I'm giving to that suffering Christ what is his due, and this is the virtue of justice, and it's helping me to grow in holiness. Now, this would be like just, on some level, just basic human needs, food, water, clothing, shelter, whatever. Here we can look at James chapter 2, right? James goes, "What shall it profit, my brethren, if a man say he hath faith, but hath not works? Shall faith be able to save him? And if a brother or a sister be naked and want daily food, and one of you say to them, Go in peace, be ye warmed and filled, yet give them not those things that are necessary for the body, what shall it profit?" If we find an absolute destitute individual, right, and we walk by with our extra cloak or whatever according to the scriptures, right, and we don't, I hope you get warm. This is actually failure in justice to give what is rightfully due to this individual, which is basic human needs. So we might also think of the Good Samaritan in this regard. Right? That parable of the Good Samaritan walking by, he was due basic bodily care. Right? That was his right by virtue of being a child, being a human being, a rational creature. But in addition to this, and we must not forget that, what the church fathers will also point out for us in that particular parable is that it's also an analogy for the state of the human soul. So as we are encountering our brothers and our sisters who are destitute in their soul, we have an obligation to try and nurture that need and to try and care for that need. And so many are in need of the gospel today, right? To receive the grace which brings healing to the afflictions of the soul. So, how do we do that? Well, we turn quite possibly to the best example of this virtue, and whose year we find ourselves still in. Saint Joseph, who was called the just man, right? It must be that he had a certain mastery over the virtue of justice. Otherwise, he would not have been called the just man, right? And it can be presumed that what this meant is he followed all the dictates of the law, right? Followed them to a T. That would be what would make him just in his day and age. Great. But there's got to be something more to that too. And where we first encounter this reality of Joseph as the just man is in the context of Joseph's decision to divorce Mary. That's a strange reality for us. When you consider that Joseph is called the just man when he's about to divorce Mary, who did nothing wrong, right? Hardly seems just. What is due to Mary in this? What is rightfully hers? Well, certainly her life. And if she had been exposed as an adulteress, she likely would have been stoned to death. An injustice, right? She was not due to lose her life for something she didn't do wrong. So she's certainly due her life. But much more than this for Joseph. That's not the reason he decides to quietly divorce her. Joseph decides to quietly divorce her because he sees her, he understands her by divine revelation in his own heart, mind, and soul. She's the new Ark of the Covenant. She's the one through whom the Messiah is coming into the world. And he believes himself to be unworthy of one who would protect, one who would care for, one who would even be in close proximity to. Remember when the ark was going through the desert and reach out and zap, right? Joseph's like, who am I? Who am I to be in this situation? And perhaps we might also say he sees himself as unable to be the one who Mary really did deserve by right, to be her caretaker and to protect her. And so injustice, it is almost injustice that he decides to free her up so that she can receive the one she is due. This could potentially be going on in Joseph's just heart. She was due the utmost respect and reverence, precisely because of who was residing within her. And Joseph, believing himself to be unworthy, just kind of sits with that for a moment. But it's then made clear to Joseph, as we know, right? No. God really did choose you. You really are the one. You really have been blessed. You really are a just man. You really are being made worthy by grace to do this. And this is your mission. This is why you've been created. And so, as he realizes this, in justice, he gives himself over to it. And he offers himself back to God in this capacity to be the caretaker, to watch over and protect and to lead and to guide. It's a beautiful reality for us to sit with. That it's not always easy. We might not always think ourselves up to the task. But when we sit with it for a moment with God and we ask him, what is it really that you want for me? What is it that you really want me? What are you calling me into? And as we come to a recognition of that, it really is just for us to follow that out. Right? We have to give back to God what he has given to us. And then we can trust that by way of distributive justice, he will give us everything we need along the way to carry it out. So we see that this virtue of justice really is tremendously important for our lives of holiness, our lives of faith. I see somebody else has this St. Joseph book. It's great. There's some really amazing, if you don't have a copy of it, get it. But there's a whole section devoted to Joseph, the just man, in here. And so It's just marvelous to read. Yeah. I've talked too long as it is. Are there any questions?
What's the name of that book you need?
Consecration to Saint Joseph, the wonders of our spiritual father. What the question was, what is the name of the book? There it is. Sorry, Greg, I'll get on it better next time. He said, please repeat the question. So there it is. What is the book? The book is The Consecration to Saint Joseph, the wonders of our spiritual father. It's a 33-day consecration to Saint Joseph, which sort of mirrors the 33-day consecration to Our Lady Mother Mary, right? So it's by Father Donald Calloway, MIC. So it's really a treasure of really good stuff on St. Joseph, and I couldn't recommend it enough. That's a great question there. So, yeah.
So, Father, this concept that Joseph was stepping aside because he didn't feel worthy, who developed that? Was that Aquinas?
No. That's kind of been in tradition for a long time, just not really held up for us in tradition. Here's the problem, is that what you ended up happening, and remember, Joseph sort of passes from this life to the next, we assume prior to Jesus' public ministry, right? And there's several reasons for that. One, because he's a just man, what is due to his child is protection and keeping him safe, raising him up in the faith, all those kinds of things. What Jesus' mission entailed was suffering and death. But as a just father, how could he allow that? Right? And so we might say that in that, there was mercy from God to relieve him of that duty prior to the public ministry. So we think he disappears out of the picture right around the time Jesus goes on public ministry, right? So because of that, there's really not a cult of St. Joseph that's built up. So let's walk down another 50, 100, 200 years, and people understand Joseph was a real guy. He really was the father. They want to uphold Mary's perpetual virginity, right? Because this is really important for us, right? And there was a lot of back and forth. There was a lot of heresies surrounding that particular doctrine, but we need to uphold that because Jesus is God and so on and so forth, right? So how do we make sure to protect Mary's virginity? Well, make Joseph a really old, crusty guy, right? Like if Joseph is well beyond the virile kind of age of a man, right, then we don't have to worry about that. Does that make sense? And so in the images that would then be portrayed in iconography and stuff, Joseph was always depicted as one who was really old, right? That completely shatters the notion of him being a virtuous man. You don't need virtue. There's no even desire there, right? Like then there's no virtue either, right? So that's kind of where a lot of that is coming out of. But you did have people who had a particular devotion to Joseph throughout the history of the church that would say, yeah, not quite, right? Not quite. And so slowly over time, as Marian kind of devotion grew, then mirroring that, you began to have more of a devotion to St. Joseph, which would come on probably more so beginning in sort of the Middle Ages and stuff like that. But you do have many different saints that have written about him in this capacity of one who was just and virtuous, who would have taken that route of humility and to say, no, I'm not worthy, right? I think it was, one of the quotes in here was, Father Ignace de la Poitiers was one of them, but you have people throughout. There's a ton of references in here, right? So of saints throughout the ages that would have gone that route. So it wasn't it's a harder position to hold, right? Because it does mean that Joseph actually had to be virtuous, right? But I think that's probably where that came from. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer. So any other? Yeah.
When you were talking about the just wage, it just got me thinking of, it seems very opposite of our culture, but so a just wage for a family with many mouths to feed versus a just wage for
Right.
just a couple mouths to feed, but then at the same time, that's not the employer's responsibility if you're doing the same amount of work. Is that, I don't know, can you give any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the question is, what is a just wage, and should it be determined upon the work being done or the mouths that need to be fed? Is that kind of the gist of it? Yeah, right. So it's a great question. I don't really have an answer, right? So I think I would say this. In one sense, is it the employer's responsibility for the choices of husband and wife? Probably not. So then we say, then we can look at, like, again, if we come back to the commutative. So this is, again, employers is really going to be more probably along the lines of a commutative understanding than a distributive one, right? There's a contractual agreement that is made. And so this is where the one who is coming in with a large family can bargain for a larger salary, certainly. Maybe they have some extra things that they can bring to the table precisely because they know I need to be up here in my field so that I can provide for my larger family, right? And so they might come into it and say, here's the salary I need. Are you willing to pay me that? And then the contract is agreed upon. So you might see it more played out in that regard rather than a distributive sort of form. In regards to work and pay and all that kind of stuff, I would say that's probably, but then you could, so if you go back again to the Israelites in the desert, it changes when you really are in a distributive form of justice and God is providing for each family unit according to their needs, with the manna and all that kind of stuff. Does that?
Yeah, no, that's good.
Okay, yeah.
I was just thinking, it used to be, with the government, you could deduct more. I mean, if you had so many kids, you could deduct more. And even the schools, the Catholic schools, like when I went, it was like the first one you had to pay full price, the second one was half price, and the third one was free. So, I mean, I don't think they do anything like that anymore.
Well, certainly I think with taxes, so again, yeah, the comment being made was that you do see some of this play out in the form of taxes where there's tax deductions for children and stuff like that. And then the Catholic school example where maybe if you have so many kids in school, the other ones don't have to pay full price, and so on and so forth. So I think we do see it play out in some areas. But again, I would say that the wage notion of it is really something that is agreed upon between the employer and the employee in a contractual sense. And so this is really more on the commutative justice level.
So you could really say, probably talking more about the mercy of God, and the people were more on commutative justice when Jesus was comparing the kingdom of the workers being called into the field and getting the same pay.
Yeah, right. Right. It's not fair. It's not fair. But this is, there was a contractual agreement, right? And that's Jesus, that's the landowner's response to him. It's like, am I not giving you exactly what we agreed upon? Right? So, there was a contract that was drafted up, even if just verbally. It was agreed upon. And in justice, what was promised was given. So all of that was a just act by the landowner who has sole propriety and can determine how much to pay each individual.
So they were probably more focused on the cumulative.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah.
He was demonstrating the distributive.
Yeah, right. Yeah, in an analogous or an anagogical way, right? As we're looking at this as an example of the kingdom of God as opposed to just a regular orchard or vineyard or whatever, right? As we're looking at this in terms of God and his eternal kingdom, yes, 100%, right? He's trying to communicate to them, you're all, right, going to be apportioned this particular same grace so that you can be eternally alive with me. Yeah. It's great. Dan's cutting me off. Good.
Yes, just
good.
Number one instruction this morning
Yes.
is keep the morning on schedule. So. Have a round of applause for Father. It was a brilliant talk.
Thank you all.